Have you ever stared at a screen just crammed with numbers and squiggly lines and felt completely lost?
Oh, yeah. I know that feeling.
It's like information overload, right?
Totally.
Like when a doctor's trying to make sense of an ECG, all those little peaks and dips, trying to figure out what your heart's doing.
Or maybe you're trying to optimize energy use in a factory.
Right. You're drowning in data, and you just want some way to cut through the clutter.
Absolutely. You're looking for those key patterns, those insights that actually matter.
Exactly. And that's exactly why we're here today for this deep dive.
Yes.
We're going to take a fascinating research paper that you shared, and we're going to pull out those essential nuggets of knowledge just for you, our listeners.
It's like a fast track to understanding the really important ideas without having to wade through all the technical stuff.
So think of this as your cheat sheet to some pretty cutting-edge data analysis.
It's good.
All right, let's get started.
Okay.
So first things first, what exactly is this research we're diving into?
Well, the paper is called COI, a multi-resolution ensemble classifier for symbolically approximated time series.
Catchy title.
Yeah. It was written by Abdallah and Gaber, and it was published in Machine Learning in 2020.
Okay.
And it really tackles a fundamental problem when you're trying to make sense of data that changes over time.
Time series data.
Exactly.
And what's the big problem there?
Well, it's the sheer variety of this kind of data. I mean, you can't expect one single method to work perfectly for every single type of time series.
Makes sense.
Right. What's really important in one type of time series, like let's say an ECG, where those tiny rapid changes could signal a heart problem.
Right.
Might be completely meaningless in another, like looking at the overall trend of energy consumption in a building over a year.
Okay, yeah, different patterns, different characteristics. They all matter for different types of data.
Absolutely.
So what's their solution? This COI thing sounds kind of intriguing.
Oh, it is. It's really clever. They took inspiration from something pretty remarkable, the compound eyes of flies. Flies?
Yeah, flies. Think about how a fly sees the world.
Okay.
It doesn't have one big lens like we do.
Right.
It has hundreds, sometimes even thousands of tiny little lenses all working together.
Okay.
And each of these tiny lenses provides a slightly different perspective.
Right.
And all those perspectives together give the fly this really wide and robust view of its surroundings, which makes it really good at spotting even the smallest movements from pretty much any direction.
So I'm picturing all these tiny little fly eyes. How does that translate to analyzing data?
Well, the COI technique works in a similar way.
Okay.
It uses multiple lenses and different ways of representing the data to get that broader picture.
Okay, but obviously we're not talking about physical lenses here. What are these lenses in terms of data analysis?
So instead of physical lenses, we have different mathematical techniques to represent the data.
Okay.
And then it combines the results from these different representations to get a more comprehensive vision for classifying that data. So it's like getting a more complete picture by looking at it from different angles, different perspectives.
Exactly.
So today's deep dive, we're on a mission. We're trying to understand how these lenses work, why combining all these different viewpoints is so powerful, and what's the big takeaway here for anyone who wants to, quickly grasp the core ideas behind this kind of advanced analysis. Are you ready to see the data through these, let's say, metaphorical compound eyes?
Absolutely. I'm ready to dive in.
All right, let's do it. So the first thing that really stood out to me in the paper was this emphasis on the idea that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to analyzing time series data.
Right, because each data set has its own unique quirks and characteristics.
And they use some really great examples right off the bat.
Yeah, they do. They compare ECG data from the medical field with spectrum data, which is used in food science, to figure out if strawberries are authentic or if they've been tampered with.
Right. And figure 1 in the paper really drives this point home. You can visually see how different these two types of time series look.
Yeah, it's striking, and it highlights the core challenge here.
Right, a method that's fantastic at detecting those super subtle, quick changes in an ECG might totally miss the more gradual variations in a spectrum.
Exactly. It's like using a microscope to look at the stars. You need the right tool for the job.
And that's why the researchers refer to this work by Bagnall and others from 2017.
Oh, yes, the categorization of time series classification techniques.
Right. They've actually categorized different time series classification, TSC, techniques based on the types of patterns they're designed to look for.
It's a really helpful framework for understanding the landscape of these methods.
Okay, so let's break down these different categories of techniques.
Sounds good.
What kinds of patterns are we talking about here?
So the first category is what they call whole series techniques.
Okay.
These methods basically look at the entire time series as one complete shape.
Like the big picture.
Exactly. And they work really well when the overall global form of the data is what matters most for distinguishing between categories.
Got it. So it's not about the little details. It's about the overall flow, the shape of the data over time.
Exactly. Like, imagine trying to recognize different dance moves.
Right.
You need to see the whole sequence of movements to tell them apart, not just isolated steps.
Makes sense. And the paper gives this example of the symbols data set, right?
Yes. And if you look at figure 2, you can see why a whole series approach works well for that. It's all about recognizing the motion of drawing different symbols. You need to see the whole thing to get it.
Okay, so that's whole series techniques. What's next?
Okay, so then we've got interval techniques.
Interval.
Yeah. Instead of looking at the whole series, these methods zoom in on specific segments or intervals within the series.
Okay, so like specific windows of time.
Exactly. And they extract features from those intervals and use them for classification. A good example here is the power cons dataset, which is shown in figure 3.
And this is about power consumption, right?
Yeah, and in this case, the patterns of power consumption during different seasons, say summer versus winter, are quite distinct, but only within certain periods of the year.
Right, so if the important differences only show up during specific time windows, it makes sense to just focus on those periods.
Exactly. That's the logic behind interval techniques.
Okay, got it. What's next?
All right, then we have shapelet-based methods.
Shaplets
Shaplets are like mini patterns, short, distinctive snippets of a time series that are really characteristic of a particular category.
Okay.
And these methods search for the presence or absence of these specific shapelets within a longer time series.
So it's like looking for a particular fingerprint within a larger pattern.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And this can be really useful for things like detecting sudden changes or recurring motifs.
Like in an ECG.
Exactly, like finding a specific little wave pattern that indicates a heart rhythm problem.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the last category?
Okay, so the last one is dictionary-based methods.
Dictionary-based.
Yeah, these techniques don't necessarily care so much about where a pattern occurs in the time series.
Okay.
What matters is how often certain patterns appear.
Like the frequency of occurrence.
Exactly. And the BISS algorithm, which they mention in the paper, is a good example of this.
Yeah.
It essentially builds a dictionary of these recurring patterns and then uses that to classify the time series.
So it's like analyzing a text by looking at how often certain words or phrases pop up, regardless of their exact position in the text.
That's a great analogy.
So we've got these 4 main categories: whole series, interval, shapelet-based, and dictionary-based. And what's the key takeaway here?
Well, as these examples illustrate, the best way to classify a time series depends heavily on the characteristics of the data itself.
Right, different data, different approaches.
Exactly. There's no magic bullet. And that's why the paper emphasizes that there is no one model that can fit all when it comes to time series classification.
It's all about choosing the right tool for the job, based on what you're actually trying to find in the data.
Precisely. And this inherent diversity in the data is what leads us to ensemble methods, which are all about combining the strengths of multiple approaches.
Which brings us right back to our fly friend and its compound eye.
The ultimate ensemble.
How does that biological inspiration actually translate to the COI technique?
Well, as we discussed, a compound eye has all these individual units, those ommatidia, each with its own lens. Figure 4 really shows this beautifully.
Right, lots of mini eyes working together.
And that gives the fly this incredibly wide field of view and makes it super sensitive to movement from any direction.
Okay.
COI mimics this by using different lenses to look at the time series data.
But again, not physical lenses.
Right. These are different ways of representing the time series data both in the time domain and the frequency domain.
Okay, time domain and frequency domain.
So in the time domain, we're looking at how the data changes over time, just as it's recorded. But in the frequency domain, we're looking at the different frequencies that make up the signal.
It's like listening to a piece of music. You can focus on the notes as they happen in time, or you can analyze the different pitches and harmonies that make up the overall sound.
Perfect analogy. Both perspectives tell us something important about the music, just like both the time and frequency domains reveal different aspects of the time series data.
Okay, so COI uses both of these views, but you also mentioned various lenses within these domains.
Yeah.
What makes those different from each other?
That's where the idea of multi-resolution comes in.
Multi-resolution.
Yeah. Within both the time and frequency domains, COI uses different levels of detail to examine the data. It's like zooming in and out with a camera.
Okay, so some lenses are looking at the big picture, while others are zoomed in on the fine details.
Exactly. And this is important because, as Figure 5 shows, sometimes you need both a broad view and a zoomed-in view to really capture the distinguishing features of the data. They use this non-invasive fetal ECG thorax 1 dataset as an example.
So using multiple resolutions allows COI to get a more complete understanding of the data, right?
Absolutely. If you rely on just one level of detail, you might miss out on some crucial information.
All right, let's talk about how these lenses actually work. The paper mentions these symbolic approximation techniques, SAX and SFA, and they describe a lens as this triplet. So let's unpack that. What is a lens in the world of COI?
Okay, so in COI, a lens is basically a specific way of converting the raw time series data into a more abstract symbolic representation. And this is done using either SAX, which stands for Symbolic Aggregate Approximation, or SFA, Symbolic Fourier Approximation.
Okay, so two different approaches, two different lenses.
Right. And the lens itself is defined by which of these techniques is used and some specific settings or parameters for that technique.
Settings.
Yeah. These parameters control how much detail we keep in the symbolic representation. Essentially, they control the zoom level of our lens.
Got it. So it's about adjusting the focus, how much detail we're capturing.
Exactly. And they use this triplet notation, SA, where S indicates whether we're using SAX, represented by 0, or SFA, represented by 1. Is the size of the alphabet we use for our symbols, and W is the word size in SAX, which relates to how long the segments of the time series are, or the number of key frequency components we keep in SFA.
Okay, so we're essentially creating different lenses by playing around with the alphabet size and the word size or number of frequency components.
Precisely. It's all about finding the right level of granularity to capture the important patterns in the data.
So let's dig into SX first. How does that work?
Okay, so as Figure 6 illustrates, SAX first standardizes the time series, so it has a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1.
Normalization.
Exactly. Then it uses something called piecewise aggregate approximation, or PAA, to reduce the complexity of the data. The W parameter here determines how many segments we divide the time series into, and then we calculate the average value for each segment.
Okay, so if W is small, we have fewer longer segments, which give us that broader overview, right?
Yeah.
And if W is large, we have more shorter segments, capturing those finer, more rapid changes.
You got it. And after calculating these W average values, SAX converts them into a symbolic string. That's where the alphabet size sign comes in. It determines how many different symbols we'll use to represent those average values.
Right.
And then the original sequence of average values becomes a simpler sequence of symbols. Basically, SAX gives us a simplified symbolic summary of the time series in its original time order.
Okay, so SAX is all about simplifying the data
Right.
while preserving the temporal order. We're essentially creating a symbolic representation of how the data changes over time.
That's right.
What about SFA?
Okay, so SFA takes a different approach.
Okay.
It first transforms the time series into the frequency domain using something called the discrete Fourier transform, or DFT.
DFT.
Yeah. Think of it as a way to break down a complex signal into its fundamental frequencies, like identifying the different notes that make up a chord.
Right, so instead of looking at when things happen, we're looking at the frequencies that make up the signal.
Exactly, and this transformation gives us a set of frequency components, and the W parameter in SFA represents the number of these frequency components that we keep. We're basically picking the W most important frequencies.
Okay, so a small w means we're focusing on the most dominant frequencies, the low frequencies, which usually represent those slower, more gradual changes in the data.
Right.
And a larger W means we're including higher frequencies as well, capturing more rapid oscillations, more fine details.
Precisely.
And then what?
Well then, similar to SIX, we convert these frequency components into a symbolic string using multiple coefficient binning, or MCB. Again, the alphabet size determines how many bins we use, and each bin gets a unique symbol. So we end up with a symbolic string, but this time it represents the frequency characteristics of the time series.
Okay, so with SAX, we're summarizing the time-based patterns, and with SA, we're capturing the frequency-based patterns.
Exactly, and both of them use these Wing parameters that allow us to fine-tune our focus to adjust the level of detail we want to capture. So how does COI actually choose which specific combinations of these parameters, which specific lenses to use for a particular problem? Because the paper mentions something called hyperparameterisation.
That's a really key part of the process. COI doesn't just randomly pick some values for W and I.
Okay.
It actually figures out the best combinations automatically through a process called cross-validation.
Cross-validation.
Yeah, and this is what they mean by hyperparameterization.
Right.
It basically means trying out a whole bunch of different W and OFF values, effectively creating many different lenses with different levels of detail.
Okay.
And then seeing which of these lenses perform best at distinguishing between the different categories in the data we already have labeled, which is our training data. Figure 8 gives a really good visual illustration of this, showing how different SAX parameters lead to different symbolic representations.
So it's like trying out a whole bunch of different pairs of glasses to see which ones give you the clearest view of the things you're trying to see.
That's a great way to think about it. And it does this for both SX and SFA.
Exactly. So COI builds this diverse set of lenses that are good at capturing different types of patterns and features in the data. Some lenses might be great at spotting those subtle local changes, while others are better at capturing broader overall trends.
Okay, so we've got this collection of different lenses which have been automatically selected. What happens next? How does COI actually classify a new time series?
So for each of these lenses that were found to be effective during hyperparameterization, COI builds a separate random forest classifier.
Random forest.
Yeah, it's a type of machine learning algorithm that's really good at handling complex data, and they refer to each of these individual classifiers as an eye. So if COI found, say, 50 different effective lenses, it would then train 50 different random forest classifiers, each one using the symbolic representations generated by its corresponding lens. And Figure 7 provides a nice visual overview of this whole process.
Okay, so the compound eye is basically a collection of these individual eyes, each looking at the data through a different lens.
Exactly. It's an ensemble of classifiers.
And when we want to classify a new time series, what happens?
Well, we first transform it using the same set of lenses that were used during training. So we get multiple symbolic representations of the new time series, one for each lens.
And then each of those eyes makes its own prediction, right?
Right. Each eye takes its version of the new time series and outputs a prediction about which category it belongs to, along with a confidence level.
Confidence level.
Yeah, basically how sure it is about its prediction. This is called soft voting. So instead of just giving a hard yes or no, each classifier provides a probability score for each category.
So we have a bunch of predictions, each with its own confidence score coming from all these different eyes. How does COI combine all of this to make a final decision?
That's where the soft dynamic voting mechanism comes in. It's really clever. Instead of just averaging all the predictions, COI actually selects the eyes that are most confident in their predictions.
So the eyes that are really sure about what they're seeing get more weight in the final decision.
Precisely. It's like a weighted average, where the weights are determined by the confidence levels, but it goes even further than that.
Okay, how so?
Sometimes the eyes based on SOX, that's the time domain view, and the eyes based on SFA, the frequency domain view, might disagree.
Right, they might see things differently.
And the voting mechanism actually considers these disagreements. If they clash on the most likely category, it looks at their second most likely categories and does another round of voting. This helps to resolve any conflicts and arrive at a more robust final decision.
So it's not just about finding the eyes that are most confident, it's also about finding agreement between the different perspectives.
Exactly.
And they have a great example in the paper with this Conflables matrix that really illustrates how this works.
Yeah, it really clarifies the process.
Okay, so this dynamic voting approach seems really adaptable, where different eyes can contribute more or less to the final decision, depending on how clear their vision is for a particular piece of data.
It's a very nuanced approach.
All right, so we've got a good understanding of how COI works, but how well does it actually perform? The paper talks about testing it on a bunch of different time series data sets.
Yeah, they used this big collection called the Extended UCR Time Series Archive, which has over 100 data sets from a huge variety of fields. It's a standard benchmark in the field, so it's a really good way to compare different methods.
Okay, so what did they find? First, In terms of their automatic selection of lenses, did it actually pick a diverse set of parameters for different datasets?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. If you look at figure 9 in the paper, it shows you how many lenses SAX and SFA contributed for each of the datasets.
Okay.
And you can see a pretty wide range, meaning that for different types of time series, different combinations of W and I were found to be most effective. It really highlights the need for this diverse set of perspectives.
Right, because different datasets require different levels of detail. And they also link this back to the visual differences we saw earlier in Figure 1, with datasets like hands outlines requiring a different set of lenses compared to BME, as shown in Figure 10.
Exactly.
Okay, what about this thing called SMOE? They mentioned it in the paper.
So SFMOE stands for Synthetic Minority Oversampling Technique.
Okay.
It's a method for dealing with class imbalance.
Class imbalance, what's that?
It happens when you have way more data points for some categories than for others in your training data. Like, imagine you're trying to train a classifier to distinguish between cats and dogs, but you have 1,000 pictures of cats and only 100 pictures of dogs.
Right, that's unbalanced.
Exactly.
And that can bias the classifier.
Yes. It's more likely to just predict cat all the time because it's seen so many more examples of cats.
Okay.
So SFMOE basically creates synthetic data points for the underrepresented categories to balance things out.
So it's like artificially creating more pictures of dogs to even out the training data.
Exactly. And Table 1 in the paper shows that using SMOE generally had a positive effect on COI's accuracy, especially in correctly identifying those instances from the less frequent categories.
Okay, so it's about making sure all the categories are fairly represented during training. Now, what about the benefit of combining SX and SFA? Was using both of these representations better than just sticking with one?
Yeah, that's a good question. And Figure 11 in the paper really clearly shows the advantage of this combination. They compared how COI performed using only SFA, and both.
Okay.
And the combined approach generally achieved better results than using just one.
So by combining those time-based and frequency-based perspectives, we get a more complete and accurate picture.
It's like having two sets of eyes, each seeing things a bit differently, and then combining their observations to get a better understanding of what you're looking at.
Makes sense. So that really reinforces the whole compound eye idea.
Right. More perspectives lead to better insights.
The paper also compared their automatic lens selection method, which they call search lenses, with just randomly picking parameter values.
Yeah, because you want to know if your fancy algorithm is actually doing something useful.
Exactly. So how did search lenses perform?
Well, as you can see in Figure 12, their automatic selection strategy generally did better than just random selection. It achieved equal or better accuracy on most of the data sets.
So it's worth the effort to find the right lenses.
It definitely pays off.
They also tested whether their choice of random forest as the base classifier was a good one. How did that compare to other options?
Figure 13 shows the comparison between using random forest and other classifiers like support vector machines, rotation forest, gradient boosting, and AdaBoost.
A lot of options.
Yeah, lots of different approaches. But in the end, random forest had the highest average accuracy across all the datasets, and was also the most consistent. So it seems like a solid choice for the COI framework because of its inherent diversity and robustness.
Okay, so it seems like COI is a strong contender. But how does it compare to other state-of-the-art time series classification methods out there?
That's the real test, right? So they compared COI with established benchmark classifiers like Euclidean distance and dynamic time warping on those UCR datasets. And Figure 14 shows that COI actually outperformed these benchmarks on a significant number of datasets.
Interesting.
And in many cases, the improvements were quite substantial, particularly in domains like spectrum analysis and power consumption data.
That's impressive.
Wow.
But what about even more advanced techniques, the real top performers in the field?
They didn't shy away from that comparison either. They compared COI to methods like BIAS, rotation forest, DTW with a learned window, SAX VSM, bag of patterns, and learned shapelets.
Wow, a lot of competition.
Yeah, it's a tough crowd. But Figure 15 shows this critical difference diagram. It basically visually compares the average rankings of all these methods across the data sets.
Okay.
And COI came in third.
Third place.
Not bad, right? Especially considering how sophisticated some of these other methods are.
And Figure 16 gives us even more detailed comparisons between specific pairs of methods.
Exactly. And these more detailed comparisons show COI's particular strengths, especially on datasets where the patterns don't shift much in time.
Like ECG and spectrum data.
Exactly. And in these cases, COI often shows significant improvements in accuracy compared to those other methods.
Okay, so while it may not be the absolute best on every single data set, it demonstrates strong and consistent performance across a really wide range of time series data.
That's what makes it so interesting. It's a versatile approach.
What about its computational demands? Is this compound eye approach super resource intensive?
That's a good practical question, and the answer is it depends. Table 3 actually breaks down the running times.
Okay.
And typically the most time-consuming part is that hyperparameterization stage during training, where COI is exploring all those different lenses through cross-validation.
Right, they're trying to find the best glasses.
Exactly. But once that's done, the actual classification using the trained random forest is pretty efficient.
So the initial setup might take some time, but after that, classifying new data is pretty quick.
That's right.
All right, finally, the paper has this case study on the beetlefly dataset where COI achieves this amazing 100% accuracy.
Yeah, that's a really cool example. Figure 17 shows the outlines of the beetles and flies just to give you a visual idea of the data.
Okay.
And their analysis, which you can see in figures 18, 19, and 20, revealed that no single eye got it perfectly right on its own. But by combining the different SX and SFA lenses and using that intelligent voting mechanism, COI nailed every single classification.
So even when the different perspectives disagreed at first, the voting process resolved those disagreements and led to a perfect score.
Exactly. It's a great example of how this ensemble approach can really shine, especially for datasets where the patterns are pretty stable over time.
So to sum it all up, COI is this clever technique that analyzes complex data through multiple lenses inspired by the compound eye of a fly.
Right.
It combines both time-based and frequency-based analysis, uses a smart voting system, and seems particularly well-suited for data where those key features occur at roughly the same time.
A powerful combination.
And I think the biggest takeaway here is the power of combining different analytical perspectives to get a more complete understanding of complex information.
Couldn't agree more.
Whether you're dealing with time series data or any kind of tricky data set, looking at the problem from multiple angles through different lenses can uncover insights that you might otherwise miss.
It's all about getting the full picture.
And while the paper concludes that COI has really competitive accuracy, especially for data without major time shifts, they also hint at some really interesting future directions.
Oh, yeah. They talk about addressing those time shifts, extending the technique to data with varying lengths, multidimensional data, and even exploring other ways of combining the results from those different eyes.
So there's still a lot to explore in this field.
Absolutely. It's an active area of research.
And that brings us to a really interesting thought for you, our listener. How could you apply this multi-lens approach to challenges in your own field?
Yeah, think about it.
Where might looking at a problem from different angles, using different types of analysis, or focusing on different levels of detail help you uncover hidden insights and gain a more comprehensive understanding? We encourage you to check out the paper itself and explore the broader field of time series analysis to dive deeper into this.
There's a whole world of fascinating techniques out there waiting to be discovered.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
Until then, happy analyzing.